It's been a while since I've added a video to my Beginner's Guide series. If you are unfamiliar with this, it's a collection of videos and a playlist whereupon I break down really specific techniques, such as how to center clay, how to lift pots off the wheel without them distorting, or in this instance, how to level the rims of your pots if they're uneven or if they're undulating slightly. This is an issue that everybody runs into when making pots, from beginners to experts. It's rather commonplace for a subtle undulation to appear in the pots you're making, when ideally we want rims like this, which are level and spin without any irregularities in them. Fundamentally, keeping the rim of your pot level is something that you should be able to manage as you're throwing a pot, and with experience you learn how to identify these issues and throw in such a way to nullify the slight undulations that appear. So, in this video I'm going to prepare 6 balls of clay, 5 of which I'll wedge up really well, simply to demonstrate how to level the rim if need be, and I'm also going to purposefully wedge one up really badly, leaving it full of holes and inconsistencies, to demonstrate how poorly prepared clay has a huge effect on the walls and rim of a pot when it comes to centering and throwing it. But even if your clay has been kneaded wonderfully, subtle undulations in the lip can still appear, as all it takes is one irregular movement with your hands as you're lifting up the walls of clay for a tiny lump or bump to appear in the rim. So, I've written myself some notes to follow, and I've watched as many videos online as I can about the subject to identify what I think works and what potentially doesn't, and so that I can create a really thorough breakdown of this process of fixing a wonky rim. The first crucial thing to understand is that undulations in the rim develop for a few reasons. The first is badly prepared clay, the second is inconsistent centering and opening up, and then there's lifting up the walls themselves. As if this is done in an unsteady and irregular manner, then those inconsistencies will simply be transferred to the lip of the pot. So throwing consistently and evenly is the greatest tool in creating rims that are even and flat, such as in the footage I'm showing you in the background here. In an ideal world, this is how the rim of every pot you make would look, unless of course you are making work that's intentionally wobbly. Yet, if you are a beginner, having the discipline to make pots with rims that are completely flat shows a good level of competence. But I will admit to one fact. Even though I have the ability to do this with most of the pots I make, I'd say if you are a beginner, it isn't something you should hyper-fixate on, as whilst undulations in the lip are obvious when the pot is spinning, as soon as the wheel stops, your eye no longer sees it. This isn't to say that you should ignore it, but if you've thrown a good pot that's 90% of the way there, then a subtle undulation in the lip isn't the end of the world. In fact, I make many simple vessels where if there is a slight undulation in the lip, I don't mind it, such as with these cups. They're well thrown, well trimmed pieces that will have handles attached. And not only do you not notice this undulation when the wheel stops spinning, but the work I create is also handmade. So if there is a bit of movement and unevenness creeping into certain aspects of the vessel, then I try not to get hung up about it. But you shouldn't use this as the sole excuse for making pots with uneven rims, as if you're looking to gain a certain level of skill and fluency in this craft, then you should teach yourself to be disciplined enough to work in a manner where this isn't always the case. It's also worth knowing that as pots dry out to leather hard, undulations can develop in the rim, and again there's absolutely no problem with levelling them at this stage, which I often do by attaching them to the wheel head upright and then by turning the lip. You may also find that if the undulation in your work is really minuscule at the throwing stage, sometimes it is easier just to deal with it once it's leather hard, especially if the shape itself is a bit more complex or has overhanging walls, like a bowl. As in those instances, trying to level the rim and make it completely even when it's sopping wet could alter the shape of the pot as you apply downward pressure, as really, the technique you use for leveling the rim does depend on the shape and how hard or soft the clay you're using is. And that's really what I want to break down in this video. There isn't a best way of leveling the rim. And in fact, I think it's a bit more situational than that, yet some techniques are slightly more beginner-friendly than others. We'll start with the basics, the root cause of unevenness in the rim. This is what we're looking for in a centered lump of clay, and if you run your finger or a tool over the surface and it leaves a clean, consistent line over it, like this, then you know it's properly centered and there's less of a chance of undulations appearing in the rest of the process. If, on the other hand, your centered lump of clay looks a bit more like this, if you scratch lines into the top, like so, and they appear predominantly on one side, this shows that there's a high point on one side of your centered lump of clay, and thus when you create the opening in this and pull those walls up, the high and low point at this stage will be transferred into the walls of the pot, and therefore the rim too. Now, an experienced potter could still work with a piece of clay like this, centering it as the base is formed and the walls are stretched out and when the walls themselves are lifted up. But if you're a beginner and your initial lump of centered clay looked like what I just had, then you're pretty much just lining yourself up for failure, and you probably need a bit more practice on getting the clay you're working with properly centered. But I think it's time I move on to the first technique on how to level the rim if it is wobbling. The most common technique and tool you'll find for this is a potter's needle. These come in all shapes and sizes, and whilst they will all fundamentally do the same thing, out of these three there is a clear winner in my opinion. You'll notice how the thickness of the point is different on each of these. The length is important too, but fundamentally the thinner the piece of metal and the sharper it is, the less resistance and drag there'll be when you're pressing it through the rim of the pot, which is precisely why I prefer this one. The point is really sharp, and the metal itself is very strong and probably twice as thin as the next one up. Additionally, the less material it wastes as it's speared through the wall of clay, which is something this thick pointer will really do. It'll create a larger gouge, and you'll have to use much more force to create the incision. So if you are looking for a needle tool, try to find one that's as thin and sharp as you can. I would recommend this one I'm using, although sadly it's no longer in production. Now, what I'm going to do with this needle is press it through the wall of clay underneath the undulating section, severing it away, essentially. But let's quickly talk grip. You want to hold the needle really firmly, with the handle pressed into your palm and with another finger braced near the tip of the pointer. The other thing I do, as best I can, is brace my arm against something. This could be the wheel tray itself, which I rest my forearm on here, or if the pot is taller I can press my arm into my torso, and I can even link my hands together, which you can see here, with the thumb of my left hand braced against my right. Essentially, you want to make your arms as stable as they can be. Your hands and the tool you're using want to stay in the exact same position as you create this incision. Instead of being influenced by the clay's rotation, your hands and the needle being dragged around as the clay spins. So, the first thing I do is identify the lowest point of the undulation. To do this, you can score a light line on the surface, and ideally you want it to be uninterrupted all the way around 2 or 3 millimeters underneath the undulating section. The reason you want the piece of clay you're removing to be uninterrupted is that it'll make lifting it off after it's been separated easier. It's also worth perhaps going just slightly lower than you think, as if you are attempting to remove a really thin, slip-covered skim of clay, you'll find that it comes off and tears in a rather messy manner, like so. And thus, if you take away just a tiny bit more, the ring of clay removed will hold its shape and will come away more cleanly. The point itself is carefully driven through the wall of clay until it touches your finger on the other side, and you want the metal tip to make contact with your fingertip on the other side for a full rotation at least. And once you can consistently feel that piece of metal, you lift both hands as one. Most of these techniques of levelling the rim take some amount of confidence to achieve a consistent, neat finish. It never really works quite as well if you're being overly cautious and precious. Instead, you just sort of have to go for it. And the absolute best thing you can do to practice this is simply throw a cylinder and then slice away layer after layer after layer. As soon as the removed section is clear of the rim, I pinch it more tightly with my left hand so that it doesn't fall back onto the pot below. And once made even, the lip can then be smoothed, beveled, and thrown to your liking. The way I do this is by wetting my fingertips. I place 2 on either side, gently pinching it, and then I press down from above. Here's the slightly thicker potter's needle, which still works wonderfully, but you can see the line it creates is so much thicker. And here's the even chunkier needle, that again still works, but I had to press much harder with it, and it also removes more clay from the incision itself than I'd like. Another thing I occasionally see people doing wrong when using a needle to slice away any unevenness on the top is pressing it into the rim from the wrong angle. The first thing that I should quickly mention is that you want to wet your digits on the inside so they don't stick to the walls of clay as they spin around. And this is the angle I want to make the incision, as the rotating clay flows into the needle smoothly. The metal isn't abruptly coming into contact with the rim, instead the initial contact is allowed to happen gradually. If instead I press the needle into the rim at a direct right angle, that initial point of contact is a bit more abrupt, and it's just a bit more likely for the tool itself to be carried away by the spinning clay, but it's still more or less controllable from this angle. And finally, the worst option is pressing the needle tip in, point forward against the spinning clay. By doing it this way, the initial point of contact is really abrupt, and you'll find that the tip of the needle will bounce on the surface, creating a really messy incision. I should also mention that throughout this process, I'm not spinning the wheel too slowly, nor as fast as I can. I'd say I'm going at about 60 or 70%, as the faster you spin, the more rapidly the clay will pass against the needle and the more consistent a line you'll create. For instance, if you go really slowly, you'll have a harder time keeping your right hand level for a certain period of time as the clay spins. But by going faster, the clay passes more quickly, and therefore the more consistent any sort of touch against the clay will be. So there's the correct angle, the not quite so good angle, and then there's the angle of collision that you should avoid entirely. You want the spinning clay to flow gradually into the tip, which it does when you hold it at a shallow angle, like so. But if it's jutted in against the flow, you'll see that the spinning clay has a tendency to yank the pin around with it. So that's how I fix a wonky rim using a needle tool. Yet, Even as I move on to the others, many of the principles, such as wheel speed, the angle of collision against the spinning wall, and removing slightly more material than you'd think, still come into effect. Now, the next technique is one I only use if I've just got to remove a very small undulation in the rim, and I do this with the turning tool, with my preference leaning towards the one I have in my hand. This technique is really simple. I wet the digits of my left hand to brace the rim, and then I simply lower the blade onto the lip, making sure that I remove the highest point that spins around first, and then I follow that point down until the rim passes underneath the blade evenly all the way around. You can even tidy up the sides and bevel the rim using this technique. It's a more delicate procedure as compared to others I'll show you in this video, so I tend to use it on pots that say have overhanging walls or complex shapes, as I'm not really exerting any pressure on the lip itself, and whilst it may look like I'm actually resting the piece of metal on the lip and pressing it down firmly, I'm really just holding the metal in place and letting the undulating clay pass against it. The trickiest thing with this technique, perhaps if you're new to it, is maintaining proper control, as it's relatively easy for the blade to catch and either be dragged around or for it to suddenly gouge away too much from underneath it, creating an even more irregular rim. These looped trimmers work too, but due to the shape of them, the clay tends to peel back onto the rim of the pot, which means you have to spend a few more moments tidying it up and removing the small chunks. Essentially, this is just trimming at the wet stage, but I find it surprisingly effective if you've only got to remove a small amount of clay. The next technique is using a wire to cut away any undulation. It's definitely effective, but I think it can be slightly trickier than using a needle, and it can leave you with a surface that isn't entirely flat, especially if you have trouble keeping your hands perfectly still. This is because it requires you to hold both of your hands level, like this, without anything really to brace them against. Depending on the wire you're using, it can also feel quite awkward holding it, but essentially all you do is create a small, taut section and guide it into the rim underneath the lowest point of the undulation, just like when I was using a needle previously. When I'm using a longer wire, it can be a bit of a challenge finding a comfortable position to do this, but the most important part is creating the small, taut section which you'll be doing the work with. I like to position my index fingers on top of the wire and press down using those. And just like when using a needle, as the wire is pressed in, before I release it and pull up, I make sure I've done at least one full rotation. As for the type of wire you're using to do this, I don't think it really makes a big difference. You can even use something like floss if you've got that on hand, but you don't want something too thick and chunky. And just like the needle again, something sharp will probably work best, as compared to say one of those thicker nylon wires you sometimes find. If you pull up too prematurely, you'll actually just end up making the undulation in the lip worse, like I've done here. And it's for this reason that when I'm pressing the wire into the rim, probably the main thing I'm focusing on is yes, keeping it level, but also making sure it's done a full rotation. This technique is really quick and efficient if you get the hang of it, but it's not a technique I would use on a really delicate shape or on the lip of a bowl with walls that really overhang, as it's easy to make a mistake, to push down too abruptly, which might cause the rim of the pot to fall even further. So this tends to be a technique that I use when the pots are still relatively thick, say when they're still being pulled up as a cylinder, or it's a shape that I know that can take it. I think it's also the technique where the piece of clay that's removed is the most likely to fall back down onto your work, especially if you're removing just a really thin skim of clay. And if it is only just a small undulation I have to deal with, I'd probably be inclined to use one of the two previous methods. The next method isn't one I see very often, but I've seen a couple of potters practice this technique over the years. It's with a sharp knife, either wooden or metal, and it's done from the inside out. This could potentially be as it's easier to brace the form from the outside, but essentially all I'm doing is the exact same thing I would have done with a needle. My fingers on the outside wait until I can feel contact with the tool all the way around, and then I lift both up together. It works as a technique, but you've got to be a lot more careful with the angle you're inserting the blade, as it's a much larger point of contact, so you really want to try and slice with it horizontally. Yet it's also rather easy to let the blade angle slightly upward or downward, which means that more of the metal is coming into contact with it, meaning you have to apply more force, which makes the process itself more difficult. Truth be told, I think you're better off using a needle to do this, but at the end of the day, the technique that works best is the one you're most comfortable with. It's the technique you feel you can be safest with, and the least likely to destroy the pots you're making, and sometimes it takes testing out 5 or 6 different methods to find the one you like. The lump of clay I'm centering is the piece I filled with air at the start, and you can see the influence an air pocket has on the rim on top. There's a very slight undulation above, and the more you throw, the worse it'll get. This is just to highlight the importance of wedging your clay properly prior to throwing. Now, this next technique doesn't require any tools whatsoever, and to show you how it works, I'm just going to create an artificial undulation in the lip. You can see how it's wavering up and down. And this technique is really simple in theory, but I think it requires a bit more expertise when it comes to throwing. Essentially, all I'm going to do is bend the rim out and then bend it inward. And as I do this, I'm constantly applying downward pressure on the rim. I then collar it inward, doing the same thing, compressing the rim, and then angle it out again, with my index finger pressed onto the top. It can take going in and out a couple of times, but after moving the clay about so much whilst constantly applying some kind of control from the top, that undulation in the rim will be slowly nullified. The change in the walls will be easier to see from this angle. I'll begin by creating an undulation in the lip, which you can see clearly here. I then make sure my hands and the rim are wet, and then I clasp the rim gently, angle it outward and then inward. But no matter whether I'm angling it in or out, notice how some part of my hand, be it the crook of my thumb at this point, or my index finger here, is pressing down lightly as I maneuver the clay. That's much better. This is probably a technique I'd save for larger pots, but also for cylinders or bowls that are midway through the throwing process, when the thickness of the walls are similar to the vessel you can see here on the wheel. The mugs I make tend to be much thinner than this, and angling the walls in and out a whole bunch of times could cause the walls to buckle as they're so thin. But on this scale it works perfectly, and you don't have to use any tools, which is pretty neat. The truth is, when I'm throwing pots, I'm constantly thinking about the rim, and throughout the throwing process I'm constantly checking it and compressing it, as a donut for instance, before it's pulled up, and after each pull too, just to make sure it's kept under control. Even if that's just a light touch and a pinch, with some compression from above to make it level. It's this sort of shape that I might feel uneasy about when using a wire to level the rim, as the walls are thin and delicate at this stage. A needle would work, but I really don't want to distort the shape of this pot. So I'll use the trimming tool to very carefully carve away that high point that's spinning around. And the more pots you make, and the more you develop your own unique style, the easier you'll find it to identify when each method should be used. As like I've mentioned numerous times now, each method shines at a particular point. The last tip I'll share is all about compression. Often you'll find that an undulation appears in the first 1 or 2 pulls, but you can quite literally centre the clay as you're pulling it up. Watch the thumb of my right hand, which is compressing the rim down as I lift it up. This means if any small undulation does appear, I can deal with it as I'm pulling the walls up. It can be quite a tricky technique to master, as not only am I focusing on lifting the walls up, but I'm also focusing on compressing the rim. This can be difficult to do on the second pull, so instead I lift the walls up, and once my index finger on my left hand comes to the same level as the rim, it slides over to be on top of the lip and then presses down. Thus, keeping the rim level again, even if there's a small pocket of air or undulation in the vessel. Beyond that, it's just being strict with yourself. Throwing and making pottery is all about being consistent and even, and at any stage when you're throwing, if you apply some sort of inconsistent movement to the spinning lump of clay, then that will impart into the stoneware itself, and depending on when it happens during the throwing process, you either have to deal with it, or you can simply let it be part of the pot's character. Like I mentioned at the start, a tiny undulation in the rim of your pot isn't going to bother anybody, unless say you're making industrially precise and perfect porcelain. And as precise and as carefully made as my pottery is, I don't mind if there is a very subtle amount of movement that creeps into my work, as long as I know I've taken enough care in making them. You may also notice that when you wire pots off the wheel, a small undulation does impart itself into the lip. This can be quite difficult to avoid, unless you throw on bats and wire all your pots off later. But I don't mind it, as I simply wait until they're leather hard, and then I deal with it at that stage. I hope you found these tips and tricks helpful. Let me know if they were in the comments. And also, if you've got any other techniques for levelling the rim, I'd love to hear about those too. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch until the end. And if you'd like to watch other videos just like this about other pottery topics, make sure you check out my Beginner's Guide playlist. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.